So let's begin the lecture for today. And I'm going to share some learning goals with you. All right, so today we're talking about consequentialism, utilitarianism, talking about what it means to maximize utility. We're talking about Mill's consequentialist ethics in particular. We're entering a new unit. And so I have some unit level learning goals for you. First, I want you to be able to understand the differences between utilitarianism, deontologism, divine command theories of ethics, and the structure of ethical theories more generally. Secondly, I want you to be able to evaluate these major approaches to ethics and articulate which one most closely approximates your own ethical views and why. And finally, I want you to be able to analyze philosophical and popular applied ethical arguments in the terms of their theoretical commitments. I'm going to add one theory to this. So we're not going to talk explicitly about virtue ethics in this unit, but we will be talking quite a bit about virtue ethics in the next unit, the unit on meaning. And so that's going to be kind of a bridge or a transition. So I'll just add to the first learning goal that you should, sort of understand the differences between utilitarianism, deontologism, divine command theory, and virtue ethics. But the virtue ethics stuff is going to come a bit later. Today's learning goals, at the end of today, you should be able to explain utilitarianism and how it relates to consequentialism more generally. Those are kind of the buzzwords for today. You should be able to identify and be able to respond to at least one major problem raised for utilitarians. Utilitarianism has just like many problems. There are plenty to go around. And so I just want you to hone in on one of them and really understand one of those in a little bit more depth. And then articulate for yourself by the end of class whether you think the ends justify the means. This is kind of a slogan that people use to characterize utilitarianism. And whether there are moral absolutes that make utilitarianism ultimately untenable. So again, in the readings for today, in the video, you saw one of the biggest objections to utilitarianism is the fact that a lot of people think there are just some moral absolutes. You should be able to understand that objection and sort of evaluate it from your own point of view by the end of today. Okay, so there's today's learning goals. Today we're going to talk a little bit about ethics. I'm going to introduce the unit by talking a bit about ethics. And ethics is the branch of philosophy having to do with the nature of morality. It's not maximally informative because, what's morality? On the other hand, I think a lot of us have a really good sense of what morality is. It's kind of an intuitive field. So whereas epistemology is something you kind of have to work yourself into and think, well, wait a second, okay, what's justification? Why would anybody think we don't have knowledge in the first place? That sort of stuff. Ethics is just much more intuitive. The subject matter of ethics is right and wrong, moral value, obligations and duties, these sorts of things, right? And these are things that we encounter in everyday life. Also within the domain of ethics are questions about responsibility, praise, and blame. So again, this is something, intuitively you'll blame people for doing something, but ethics asks the question, what is it that grounds those kinds of claims? And then it's also concerned with the nature of goodness and moral value. Some ethical questions that you might ask, paradigmatic ethical questions, are things like, what do we owe to each other? Where owe means something like morally owe each other, right? So not just like, you should pay your financial debts, that sort of thing. Do we have moral obligations or moral debts, moral duties towards each other? Other ethical questions, what ought I to do? What should I do? What am I permitted to do, right? What's morally permissible? Finally, what are we responsible for? What are the conditions under which we deserve praise and blame for acting? So those are paradigmatic ethical questions. And ethical theories, ethical theory in general, are any theories about any of the things within that domain that I just articulated. So a theory of moral responsibility is a kind of ethical theory. A theory about moral obligation is a kind of ethical theory. And Many ethical theories, the most prominent ethical theories, offer a unified picture of some or all of the like subject matter, all of the things that I mentioned in the domain of morality. And they have a structural picture on which something serves as the good and the source of moral value, and the remaining ethical concepts are then defined in terms of that good. So let me show you structurally kind of what I mean. Okay. So in ethical theory, if you look all the way to the left of the screen, this is kind of the structure of certain ethical theories. They'll articulate or identify an ultimate good. And then in terms of that good, they'll identify principles for right action, right? Principles that should guide your action. If you want to be a moral agent, this is what you should do. And then tied up with that, they'll give you an account of what the good life is, what it means to live well. So in a way, you can see we're moving through all the themes of this course. At the beginning, we were talking about what should you believe. And then we started talking about should you believe in God, right? We were moving from God. And now we're moving kind of into the good life section of the course. What is a good life? What constitutes a good life ethically? And then in terms of other kinds of value. We're going to circle back around and consider some theistic pictures of some of this stuff in a bit. But that's how it relates to the broader questions of the course. Now let's look at a couple particular ethical theories to illustrate this structure. So in ethical theories, so the first ethical theory, the theory in the middle, that's virtue ethics. I didn't label it, but it's virtue ethics, right? And in virtue ethics, the ultimate good is identified as eudaimonia or eudaimonia, depending on how you pronounce Greek. Basically, this is a placeholder word. We don't translate it because the translations into English don't seem to capture the meaning of the word very well. On some interpretations, it's translated happiness, just like utilitarianism sort of has happiness as its ultimate goal. Virtue ethics is often thought to have happiness. But it really means something more like human flourishing, right? Or living an excellent life. A life excellence along all the dimensions appropriate to human beings, the kind of beings that we are, right? So it includes more of a sense of flourishing than just mere happiness. Happiness sometimes sounds a little bit psychological. Eudaimonia is supposed to be more like flourishing. And on virtue ethics, or a virtue ethical theory, actions are right if they're the sort of thing that virtuous agents would do, right? So they first define the ultimate good. They say it's living well or flourishing. And then they say, so if you want to know what the right thing to do is, well, just look at somebody who's living well or flourishing. They have a word for this. They call that person the phronimos, call it the practically wise person. And so right action for virtue ethics is what the virtuous person would do. Of course, the good life for the virtue ethicists is a life of virtue, a life of excellence, a life of eudaimonia, something that instantiates that value. And so that's kind of the structure of virtue ethics. Similarly, on the very far right here, we have deontologism, a Kantian sort of deontologism. For deontologists like Kant, the ultimate good is experiencing or having full agency, being totally integrated as an agent. Super confusing. We're going to talk about it when we talk about Kant. But for Kant, the way that you get that is by acting in accord with duty. We have certain duties. We can never act against duty and be doing the right thing. So right action is defined in terms of duty, which falls out of what it means to be a full or integrated agent. Okay, so those were examples to help you see the structure of ethical theories. And now we'll talk a bit about consequentialism and utilitarianism in particular. So utilitarianism is the view that the greatest good for the greatest number is the ultimate value, or the maximum. So you can think of the greatest good for the greatest number as the maximum amount of overall happiness, defined roughly in terms of pleasure, although there's a lot of caveats. Mill brought a lot of those to our attention today in the reading. It also holds that you can only really appreciate moral value, you can only really experience the kinds of pleasures that you ought to experience if you're well-formed, properly cultured, and educated, right? You have to sort of be in a certain position to appreciate ethical value for utilitarians. This is a way that they get around some of the obvious objections. You might think, well, look, if utilitarianism is just the view that you ought to maximize pleasure, then shouldn't we just, find the most pleasurable kind of activity and then make sure that most people are doing that kind of activity overall? And then you start looking at that and you think, oh yeah, but that would make society look horrible. That would make an individual life look awful. And so utilitarianism says, well, no, hold up. You have to sort of relativize pleasure to a certain kind of person. They have to have achieved a certain level of culture and education. And finally, utilitarianism says, what ought you to do? What is the right thing to do? Well, it's the thing that you think will lead to the best consequences. That is the greatest amount of pleasure or the most happiness for the most people. So again, in terms of the structure that we've been sort of using to capture ethical theories, utilitarianism thinks happiness, defined in terms of pleasure, is the ultimate value. They think actions with the best consequences for the most people, those are the actions that you should do. That's what it's right to do. They think a life of pleasure, defined in this kind of special way, is the good life. That's what it means to live well. Further, utilitarianism is structurally a consequentialist ethical theory. It claims that the act with the greatest consequences, most happiness for the most people, is the right thing to do. In general, consequentialist theories take the consequences of an action to determine that action's value. So you can have consequentialist theories along any dimension of value. This might be slightly confusing, but we'll take a brief detour. So think about what a consequentialist epistemic theory would say. A consequentialist epistemic theory, theory in epistemology, would say you ought to believe that which is most likely to lead to knowledge, right? So again, this is just to show you that consequentialism is the structure of the theory. It has less to do with the ethical content than it does with the structure of the theory, the way in which value is ordered on that theory. Okay, so that's the relationship between utilitarianism and consequentialism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that is an instance of consequentialism, right? It's a species of consequentialism. So that's the relationship between those two. And if that's somewhat unclear, we'll have a chance during the Q&A to talk about the relationship between those two things. But for now, we're going to talk about 4 objections to utilitarianism in the time we have left during the lecture. Okay, so here's a preview of them. We'll talk about each of these in a little bit of detail. Here's a preview of them. So I'm going to talk about 4 different objections. The first is that it seems like there are some moral absolutes, things that you just can't do under any circumstances. But according to utilitarianism, what you ought to do is whatever brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So according to utilitarianism, there are no moral absolutes. You should be able to violate any purported moral absolute given sufficiently good consequences. Some people think it's really implausible, and we'll talk about why in a second. Second objection is commensurability. So it doesn't seem like you can always weigh different kinds of goods, even different kinds of pleasures, right? Or alternatively, it doesn't seem like you can always weigh the happiness of different individuals against one another, right? So utilitarianism says, look, in order to figure out what to do, we have all of these complex sort of formula. You can just calculate out, okay, who's going to get this much pleasure? Who's going to get this much pleasure? Which of those is greater? Do the one. Well, what if the different relata there are not commensurable? What if you can't add them up? What if you can't compare them? That would be a huge problem for utilitarianism. Thirdly, it seems like there are moral exemplars that have not at all lived by utilitarian principles, right? A very famous objection or criticism of Mother Teresa, for instance, is that she wasn't doing overall what was best for the people in her care, right? Christopher Hitchens wrote a very famous piece attacking Mother Teresa and said, look, she should be more utilitarian. Why does she go and care for people on the streets when she could, you know, like be an investment banker and like donate all that money, something like that, right? And still, a lot of people think, well, no, she's a moral exemplar. She's living a good life. And if that's the case, then utilitarianism seems to have a problem. Doesn't seem to be able to explain that. Finally, we'll talk about some ambiguities in the ultimate good for utilitarianism. So if we define the ultimate good as happiness, we define happiness in this quasi-psychological way, it seems like there's just a lot of different things that might count for that. And so utilitarians are going to have to tell us which of those they mean. Okay, so I'm going to sketch these somewhat briefly. We'll talk about them during the small and large groups. First, moral absolutes. Utilitarianism says that whatever action brings about the most good for the most people is the right thing to do, but it seems like this is false. First, consider Bernard Williams' scenario. It was brought up in the video that you watched for today. You're offered the chance to shoot one person in order to save 10 others, right? Some evil villain comes up to you and says, I'm going to kill all these people, but if you shoot one of them, then I'll spare the other 9. Bernard Williams says, even though obviously this is going to have the best consequences objectively considered in some sense, you shouldn't do it because you shouldn't kill people, right? Bernard Williams says any ethical theory that entails that it's acceptable to intentionally kill someone is a false ethical theory. That's his objection. And we can make it even worse. Consider this. So this thought experiment comes from a short piece of fiction. I'm going to look it up and I'll send it to you or I'll post it somewhere. I forget the author and the title, but I read it, I think, at some point. And so here's the thought experiment. What if somebody came up to you and made the following offer? They said, look, I will donate $1 billion to a local art museum if you just continuously torture one child to death over the course of a year. So the $1 billion is surely going to result in a net gain in happiness, right? Maybe the commensurability thing comes in here too, but surely look, you're going to make a ton of people happy. And in fact, you're going to make them happy in exactly the way that Mill thinks is the best kind of happiness, right? They're going to have this educated, cultured, sort of aesthetic experience. And that's of great value, right? And all you have to do is just torture one child for like a year. Now, clearly, if you have the intuitions I have, you think, of course you couldn't do that. That's insane. That's terrible. You could not do that, right? It would not be ethical to do that. But if that's the case, then utilitarianism has to explain why. Either they have to take on some sort of implausible commitment and say that the $1 billion donated to the art museum wouldn't actually result in a net gain. It seems like that's going to involve a lot of maneuvering. So they have to explain that. Okay, so much for moral absolutes. Let's talk a little bit about commensurability. So utilitarianism presupposes that we can compare and calculate all moral goods in terms of pleasure or happiness, but this seems false. How would you compare my enjoyment in reading a book to Justin's enjoyment in going to a rock concert? Seems like they're different kinds of pleasure, right? Which one is better? What sort of units would you use to measure them and to compare them with one another? More drastically, is it better to let people to struggle to define and enact a fair and just state on their own, or should you just colonize and rule over their state, given that the state would likely be more corrupt overall than your colony, at least for a while? A lot of people might have the intuition that there's a lot of good in someone's establishing their own constitution for a state, going through that struggle, even though it involves a lot of pain. Or how about this? Does your right to free speech and the pleasure or enjoyment you take in exercising it take precedence over my preference not to be constantly bombarded by political activism? Could we compare those two things, and how do we compare them? Secondly, a second objection in terms of commensurability is that utilitarianism requires that you take an objective stance and consider the good of humanity as a whole, but it doesn't seem like this is possible or desirable. If a stranger starts drowning at the exact same instant that your son starts drowning, should you really be totally indifferent as to which one you save? According to utilitarianism, you should start calculating. Be like, well, okay, the stranger has X number of years. In those years, they're likely to experience this kind of, is that even plausible? Should you do that? Is that a moral way to go about making that decision? Or how about this one? You can pay for private school for your kids, or you could donate that money and let your kids go to a public school. Are you really obligated to donate that money? And if you are, what's sort of the upper bound of your obligations there? Do you have no obligations to those around you, those in your family, that take precedence over the common good or the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Thirdly, let's talk about moral exemplars. Lots of moral heroes sacrifice their lives for their ideals, refusing to compromise, even when doing so would in some sense promote more overall benefit for those around them. Utilitarianism claims that they're either irrational or immoral in doing so. They're not doing the right thing. But it seems like, of course they are, right? Mother Teresa was an example that I gave above. Or how about other people who are threatened in horrible regimes, right? Where somebody says, look, if you just do this one evil thing, we'll let 100 people go. We often hold the people who refuse to do that thing, we hold them up as moral exemplars. We think they're particularly moral people, but utilitarianism can't account for that. Finally, I'll just reference or point to the ambiguity in the ultimate aim. It's not exactly clear what utility is, what pleasure is, and what happiness are, and whether these are the ultimate goods. And this is obviously something utilitarianism would have to figure out before we can figure out if it's tenable or not. So in conclusion, Mill tries to respond to some of these objections in the reading for today and others that we haven't raised, as does Peter Singer. You read something by him, and I think there was a podcast that was also assigned by Peter Singer. He's a contemporary proponent of utilitarianism in a form called effective altruism, which we'll talk about in a bit. So in the remainder of class, we're going to debate the merits and drawbacks of this view, and in the remainder of the unit, we're going to do the same with a couple other ethical theories. Okay, so that ends today's lecture.